On the banks of Oregon's Willamette River, hidden among the trees at River Mile 30.7, is a forgotten remnant of the past. The place is Coalca Landing, a small nature preserve that's been abandoned for several years. Ever since I learned of this park's existence, I've been trying to figure out when and why it closed. Information has been hard to come by, but I've finally been able to piece together enough of the story to give us a good idea of what happened here. A couple years ago, I was looking at Google Maps in the greater Portland metro area, specifically between Canby and Oregon City. Route 99 East follows the river here for about 7 miles between the two cities. And while it's a nice drive, there's not much of anything on this route. However, I happened to notice something called Coalca Landing State Park. I had no idea we had a state park here, but even more strangely, it was marked as permanently closed. This obviously piqued my curiosity, and I tried doing some simple online searches for the park. But I quickly learned that there's very little evidence that this place ever existed. No page on the state park's website. No mention on old maps. As I started to read people's blogs and forum posts, it only raised more questions. The park was a curiosity even a decade ago when it was still open, and then it seemingly faded away without any explanation. I've been researching this topic on and off for the last year, hitting multiple dead ends and even giving up on the project more than once. But today I can finally share with you the story of Coalca Landing, first exploring its history, and then figuring out where it all went wrong. To understand the history of Coalca Landing, we actually have to look at the steep cliff across the highway. It's all but forgotten now, but there's a unique rock formation on this cliff called Coalca's Pillar, sometimes referred to as Balancing Rock. The name Coalca came from the native Molalla peoples, who used the rock as a visual landmark along the river. They had their own legends surrounding it, but as you might expect, multiple versions of the story were printed over the years. One of the earliest examples was featured in Sunset magazine in 1900. To summarize, Coalca was the young chief of the Molalla tribe. He was in love with Nawala, a woman from the neighboring Clackamas tribe. He was so desperate to have her that he snuck into their camp at night and kidnapped her. War broke out between the two tribes, and Nawala died of a broken heart. Coalca was driven off the cliff, and the Great Spirit punished him by turning him into a pillar of stone. A decade later in 1910, the Oregon Daily Journal described the scenic beauty of the area itself, saying, quote, "The trip south along the Southern Pacific Railroad to Coalca, 3 or 4 miles distant from Oregon City, is a great favorite with hiking parties from Oregon City. The walk leads one along the banks of the ever-beautiful Willamette through an attractive bit of woods. Arriving at Coalca, a small railroad station, one is confronted on the east side by frowning cliffs, 100 feet or more in height. And it is at the top and at the brink of the highest of these that Coalca's Pillar, or the Devil's Footstool as it is sometimes called, stands out prominently. The pillar was a popular local landmark through the first half of the 20th century. While it was never a part of what would eventually become Coalca Landing, the pillar almost got a small state park of its own. I found a couple newspaper articles from June of 1950 that said the state had taken ownership of the cliffside, and locals were eager for it to be turned into a park. One of the most helpful resources I found, a blog called Cyclotram, gives some additional context to this. It says, "This rock was once a big local tourist attraction, back in the days when 99 East was the main road into Portland from Point South. Back then, the area had been logged relatively recently, and trees were smaller, so rock formations like this were easier to spot. The state bought the land in June 1950 when Highway 99 East was being widened. The state considered putting in a highway wayside near the pillar, but that seems to have never come to pass." This is pretty interesting, as it reminds us that this was at a time before the interstates were built. Route 99 was the most prominent road in the state. and a great number of drivers were passing through Coalca on a daily basis. I do think the roadside attraction could have been pretty popular at the time. But the idea never panned out, and Coalca's pillar has faded into obscurity in the years since. It's very difficult to see from the highway today, and there's no official way of hiking up to see it. Now, the spot on the riverbank that would eventually become Coalca Landing itself was developed by the Dornbecker Manufacturing Company in 1900. Through the early 20th century, they would become one of the largest industrial companies in Portland, and for a time, they were one of the largest furniture makers in the United States. In fact, Dornbecker's main plant in Portland is still standing today, situated near I-84 and now being used as a self-storage facility. Dornbecker chose to build its sawmill about 15 miles south at Coalca. This put it closer to some of the local logging operations along the river. 1900 was also the year that the Southern Pacific Railroad chose to build a train depot here. As far as I can tell, this was largely meant to serve the sawmill workers, but it's possible there may have already been some people living here as well. The rail route itself had been around for decades at this point, and in fact, it was actually the first one to be built into Portland. Back in 1869, the Oregon Central Railroad had built its first 20 miles of track between Portland and the small community of New Era, less than a mile south of Coalca. In the coming years, the line was extended all the way to California, and it would eventually become Southern Pacific Shasta route between Portland and San Francisco. The Coalca Depot was one of the many smaller stops on the Shasta route through the early 20th century. I've looked through several of their timetables from this era, and it seems that Coalca only appeared a few times, specifically in the early to mid-1920s. Today the rail line is owned by Union Pacific and remains very active, but any traces of the depot are long gone. The Dornbecker sawmill is another story. Photos show several small concrete structures strewn across the park. It's believed that these are remnants of the sawmill, which would make them over 120 years old. After operating for more than 50 years, the sawmill was permanently closed in December of 1954, when the Dornbecker Company shut its doors for good. The site was purchased in the following month by two logging industry veterans named R.B. Reynolds and J.D. Coleman. About a year and a half later, in September of 1956, they sold it to the Publishers Paper Company. Publishers was one of the big players in the local paper industry, and they had numerous mills spread across Oregon. They were reportedly going to use the Coalca property for decking logs. An article at the time described the property, saying, quote, "There is 2,500 feet of river frontage on its blacktopped area adjacent to the main line of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Only empty buildings are on the site." So to me, this suggests that the sawmill was never reopened after Dornbecker shut its doors. It seems that the machinery was sold off and the buildings were left abandoned. Since Publishers Paper was basically going to use the site as a storage area for logs, they may have demolished the remaining buildings to make more space. But that's really just my best guess, as this is the last record I could find of any industrial use of the property. Let's fast forward a few years to the 1960s. By this point, the environmental movement was starting to put more of a spotlight on the need to preserve Oregon's natural beauty. This came to a head in 1966, when Robert Straub and Tom McCall were campaigning against each other for the governor's seat. Straub put forth a radical idea for a project called the Willamette River Greenway. The idea was that the state would acquire the land along the entire length of the Willamette River, from Springfield to Portland. This would create a continuous public park nearly 200 miles in length. Straub would ultimately lose the election to Tom McCall. But McCall was an environmentalist himself, and he supported Straub's vision for the Greenway. He took it upon himself to put the plan into action, and over the next several years, the state tried to acquire as much of the land as possible. This turned out to be extremely controversial with local farmers. And by the time Robert Straub became governor in 1975, It was clear his original vision would never be realized. But in the process, the state had acquired a patchwork of nearly 90 parcels of land along the river. Some of these would be developed into fully fledged state parks, like Willamette Mission State Park, north of Salem, and Molalla River State Park, just a few miles upriver from Coalca. However, most of the properties would remain within the smaller Willamette Greenway system. Now, I want to spend a minute here to clarify the difference between the two categories. The state parks are more widely known, and are typically larger and feature more amenities for guests. This includes things like hiking trails, campgrounds, parking lots, restroom facilities, picnic areas, and boat ramps. By comparison, most of the Greenway parks are much smaller and have minimal accommodations. Oregon Parks and Rec describes them as, quote, low-key open spaces. A few have boat launches and vault toilets, and others, nothing. In other words, the Greenway parks are generally lesser known and are not designed for high visitor traffic. This fits the bill perfectly for Coalca Landing, which was only about 15 acres and barely had any services on site. Indeed, the park is still considered a part of the Willamette Greenway today. So while it's accurate to call it a state park in the general sense, it never technically fell into the state parks category that most people are familiar with. As far as when specifically it was developed into a park, I haven't been able to dig up any information. My best guess is that it happened sometime in the mid-70s, when most of the land acquisitions took place. For reference, let's take a look at this aerial photo from 1975. It's hard to make any clear deductions from this image, but it looks like this area is cleared out and there are very few trees on the property. To me, this indicates that the land was either recently handed over from its industrial use, or it was still actively being used. The next aerial photo I could find is from 2 decades later in 1995. Thanks to the higher resolution, we can see that most of the trees and other plant life had grown back by this point. And this is actually more or less how it still looks today. While I don't know precisely when the park was established, I did manage to find a few articles from the 1980s and 90s that alluded to its existence. In the summer of 1985, Portland Mayor Bud Clark made a publicized trip to Coalca to spend the day with the community's honorary mayor, Roger Dale York. This article doesn't mention the park specifically, but it does give us a glimpse into the community at the time. Coalca was described as being home to 12 full-time and 5 part-time residents. The article went on to say, "The unincorporated community is located next to the Willamette River, and in years gone by was a bustling location with a large sawmill. This suggests that the industrial use of the area was long gone by this point. There's also a brief mention of an annual Coalca Days picnic on Labor Day Sunday. Call it a hunch, but a public park right in their backyard seems like the perfect place for this." In December of 1986, improvements were announced for a variety of boating facilities across the state. Among these, this article makes the very brief statement, "Improved toilets at Coalca." The park was briefly mentioned again in the summer of 1990. It was the meeting spot for a summer workshop, where blind children got a chance to go water skiing on the river. In June of 1996, Oregon Parks and Recreation announced that they would have to permanently close 64 parks due to a lack of funding. These were slated to be closed at the end of the summer. As you probably guessed, Coalca Landing was listed among the parks slated for closure. I wondered whether this was the beginning of the park's downfall. If so, it could suggest that there were dozens of other abandoned parks scattered across the state. But looking closer at the list, I knew that several of these parks are still open today. Some of them I've even visited myself fairly recently. I dug a little deeper into the story and learned that the closures never actually ended up happening. The news was alarming to politicians and voters alike, and new long-term funding was soon found to keep the parks open. So if Coalca Landing wasn't the victim of widespread closures in the mid-90s, what happened? The next event worth mentioning took place in the early 2000s. The Willamette River Water Trail was established, and designated the river as an official trail for water-based recreation. This was dedicated in 3 sections between 2005 and 2007. A document I found from 2007 provides guidelines for the management of the river trail. This also includes write-ups for every park along the trail. It says, Coalca Landing has a gravel parking area with fishing and swimming access. It has a small picnic area with tables and a garbage can, as well as a pit toilet. Believe it or not, these 2 sentences are the earliest description I could find of the park itself, despite the fact that it was something like 30 years old at this point. This page also provides a convenient chart showing what the park did and didn't offer, and it didn't offer much. There was no dock or boat ramp on site. Instead, visitors would take a short walk down the riverbank to a small sand beach, where they could launch their kayaks or canoes. There's also mention of a dirt hiking trail. Since there's almost no maps that acknowledge the park, period, finding a trail map is nearly impossible. But I did manage to find one on OpenStreetMap. This shows it running the length of the park, which I measured to be about a half-mile long. Stepping forward a few years, Coalca Landing started to see a handful of mentions online by locals. Flickr user Jayne Cravens posted these 2 photos in 2011, and described the park at the time, saying, quote, I can't find it on any maps. I found the park because there is a tiny, and I mean tiny, Oregon State Park sign on Highway 99 East, at the driveway that takes you to the park. Everyone I asked about it in Canby stared at me blankly, and assured me there was no park there. A representative I met from Oregon State Parks told me she had no idea what I was talking about. This account is really fascinating to me. Even at this time when the park was open, it was so obscure that people living just within a few miles had no idea it existed. To be fair, I've driven past it on the road myself, and even knowing exactly where it is, it's very easy to miss. And just a note about the state park sign on the highway, it seems to have been removed a few years after this account was written. Now, there's a comment on Jayne's photo by Flickr user Usforestkeepers, who said, quote, I am the volunteer park ranger at Coalca Landing. Actually, this is what is called a satellite park. Small and nearly forgotten, there are a few of these around Oregon. I clicked on his username just on a whim, and I'm glad I did. He has some of the best photo documentation of the park that I've ever seen. In fact, a few of the photos I've been showing are from his extensive collection. Now, to narrow down the time frame of the park's closure, I've collected several separate pieces that tell a story when they're all placed in order. To start off, Google Street View from September of 2012 shows the park gate open and at least 1 car parked in the lot. 7 months later, in April of 2013, a geocache was hidden in the park. In the user's description of the area, this part stuck out to me. Quote, there are no parking signs at the entrance, and the gate to the parking lot is locked. If you can find a way to get there, the cache is there for the finding. This is the first account I could find of the parking lot being closed. But then we have a video from 3 months later in July, posted by YouTube user Nightfoam. The parking lot is clearly open again, and there are cars parked here. Just a few weeks after this video was posted, a commenter on Cyclotram's blog post said, quote, I stopped there for the first time today on my way home from work to check out the fishing opportunities. I like that the trail downstream takes you right to the south end of Rock Island. There is good fishing there. So despite the park being closed in April, we have 2 accounts confirming it was back open in July. 8 months later, in March of 2014, the park was mentioned by a user in the Oregon Hikers forums. He said, quote, the local park by my house, Coalca Landing, is still closed. They closed it for the federal shutdown. It's still closed with the same sign on the gate. He was referring to the shutdown of the federal government that lasted for about 2 weeks in October of 2013. National parks across the country were temporarily closed during this time. But to the best of my knowledge, federal shutdowns don't impact locally managed parks. I actually do think Coalca Landing closed at around that same time, but I believe the two events were unrelated. 2 weeks after that forum post, the park's closure was confirmed again by a forum user on ifish.net. Quote, Coalca Park/Landing is closed until further notice. Just drove by there this morning. Gate was locked up. This soon spawned its own separate conversation, where another user said, quote, well, did the research myself, and the park is closed basically for good. So looking at this pattern, it might not immediately make sense why the park would flip between being open and closed. But here's my theory. The parking lot was open in the summer of 2012, and was then closed during the off-season months from late 2012 to early 2013. Other parks in this area have trails and campsites that are only open seasonally. It's possible this had been applied to Coalca Landing at some point. If so, the park would have reopened around May, and then closed again by around October. This is all relying on a bit of guesswork, but I think it's a plausible explanation. I haven't found any personal accounts of the park after this point, so my theory is that the parking lot closed permanently around October of 2013. As if this story wasn't convoluted enough, it seems the parking lot closure wasn't the final nail in the coffin for Coalca Landing. There's evidence that the park actually remained open, potentially for several years. But from this point onward, it was only publicly accessible from the river. Let's start by comparing these two photos of the park's main signboard from 2011 and 2016. A few things were moved around, but the most notable change was the addition of this motor vehicles prohibited sign. This seems to confirm that the park was converted to river access only at some point in this time frame. Supporting this idea is this Google Street View image, also from 2016, where the parking lot is locked up and starting to show signs of overgrowth. Perhaps the best account of this was written a couple years later in 2018. Clackamas County had contracted a study to analyze how its parks were being used and where improvements could be made. This resulting document gave status updates on pretty much the entire river through the county. For Coalca Landing specifically, it says, recently, the road to this area has been closed, and therefore the only access to this site is by boat or on foot. While this prevents car-top boats from launching and taking out here, it does increase the opportunities for remote camping, fishing, nature viewing, and picnicking. The final and most recent piece of information is from 2021. A realtor's video shows some great drone footage of the surrounding area. This is the most recent photography we have of the park, and it gives us a clear view of what the parking lot looks like today. The video also makes this interesting statement.
This property is located by Coalca Landing, a state park that is closed to the public and only available to be accessed by this property or by the river.
So the signs seem to point to the park technically being open, but there's one sign that's conspicuously missing. In the footage, we can clearly see the park's main signboard is no longer here. Earlier photos placed it on the northwest corner of the parking lot, but the fact that it's been removed could suggest the park is now closed entirely. The only official acknowledgement of the park online is on the Willamette River Trail website. This page doesn't tell us anything we don't already know, but the fact that the park is shown here would suggest that it's still open. Then again, it also says the park has vehicle access, which hasn't been true for several years. Given all these conflicting accounts, I decided it was finally time to set the record straight. I reached out to the folks at Willamette Riverkeeper, a nonprofit group that serves as one of the caretakers of the river and its surrounding habitats. I asked if they could clarify whether Coalca Landing is still publicly accessible from the river, or whether it's closed entirely. I also asked if there might be any opportunity to volunteer at the park to help rehabilitate it. In response to my questions, Willamette Riverkeeper verified the answers with Oregon Parks and Recreation. They said, quote, "The site is definitely closed. It has been that way for a few years. It is one of those sites that Oregon Parks and Rec had a hard time managing given its location. Also, the river access was relatively steep. Apparently there were some illegal activities occurring there, and they decided to call it good. These details definitely shed some new light on the whole situation, but at the same time, they're not too surprising. We know the park was fairly well hidden, and as a result, it seems to have suffered from low attendance for years. The location eventually became a problem for another reason too. One of the forum posts from 2014 that I mentioned earlier made the additional comment that, quote, apparently the road crossing over the train tracks was never technically legal. I actually wouldn't be surprised if this were true, as the entrance to the parking lot is basically part of a private driveway. The only way to remedy this would be to build a completely new separate driveway across the railroad tracks, which from a cost perspective alone is probably not justifiable. I've actually always assumed that Coalca Landing had some funding issues, and that seems plausible from my research. For example, Cyclotram makes the comment that, quote, the entire Greenway system has been in a sort of political and financial limbo ever since the initial burst of enthusiasm faded in the late 1970s. Oregon Parks and Rec has even said itself in the past, quote, many parks that exist along the Willamette River cannot adequately respond to growing recreational needs because of a lack of funding to provide access facilities and operational supervision. So presumably, due to a lack of funding, the park couldn't be monitored very closely. This probably led to the unfortunate side effect of vandalism or other illegal activities taking place. And on top of all this, it sounds like even the river access was fairly inconvenient. Lugging your boat up a steep and narrow trail isn't ideal, and the sand beach itself has also reportedly been degraded over the years due to boat wakes. So this probably discouraged people from accessing the park by the river, which had really become the only way to get there in the first place. Also, just within a few miles, you have 3 other public parks equipped with full boat ramps. Most people probably just figured it was easier to go to one of those spots instead. So with all these factors considered together, Coalca Landing's closure starts to make a lot more sense. And it certainly paints a much more complex picture than I ever imagined. The closure of Coalca Landing is unfortunate, but I don't see it as a failure on anyone's part. These situations are never as simple as they appear on the surface. But even with all the factors working against it, Coalca Landing could potentially make a comeback someday in the future. In my correspondence with Willamette Riverkeeper, they told me, quote, at some point Oregon Parks and Rec may reopen it, but no timeline suggested. Willamette Riverkeeper's website also says, today there is active interest by Oregon Parks and Rec in increasing the management of these properties after many years of letting these properties languish. Whatever this ends up meaning for Coalca Landing, we'll have to wait and see. But even if it never reopens to the public, it'll still be fulfilling a noble purpose. The whole point of these parks is to preserve the natural beauty and habitat of the river. And as nature continues to reclaim the park, it's probably closer to its natural state now than it's been in over 100 years. So if nothing else, I think we can take some solace in that.